Hello, good evening. This is Stephen, and this is my final project oral presentation for the News, Film, and Literature class for the fall session of 2017. For my final project, I chose to do the subtitling of a video, and I'll get into in just a little bit what that video was and kind of the process that I went about, some of the issues I ran into, some of the ways I handled it, and kind of a brief summary of that. Kind of before I get into that, though, just to summarize kind of what I've learned in the class so far, is just in a nutshell, just kind of the way over the last 50 years or so, since I'm 46 myself, just kind of in my lifetime, the way that we've interacted with text has changed pretty significantly. Whereas, even just as recently as just 50 years ago. Everything that came out tended to be, would have to be printed by someone that, had the means of distributing something like newspapers, magazines, that sort of thing. So the people that had control over what was printed, what went out to the public, was a much smaller group. Whereas currently, anyone that has a mobile phone and a Twitter or Facebook account can publish something that will be can be immediately viewed around the world. So the role that the translators have has expanded exponentially because cultures that previously didn't interact are interacting quite a bit more than they had in the past. So and kind of as an example of that, I have a young son, which when he was maybe 3-4 years old and was starting to read, I was showing him how to do that by writing the alphabet on a piece of paper, and when getting to the end of the alphabet, he asked me if I could turn them off, which took me a while to figure out what he was trying to say. And what I finally figured out was he thought he was so used to seeing stuff on a screen that he thought I could just turn the letters off after I wrote them. So he had no concept of what writing something on paper was, which was, as a much older person, that was very strange to me. So, I've always been interested in subtitling. I kind of growing up as an American in Mexico. I remember watching a lot of the majority of the American programs in Mexico ended up being dubbed, which I didn't really care for. But I enjoyed going to the movies, which American movies in the theater tended to be subtitled, and there was a weekly on Sundays there was a weekly English language film that was a program called Cine Permanencia Voluntaria, which is roughly voluntary viewing cinema, which I always to this day think that was a bit of a weird name, but that was kind of my first exposure to viewing things with subtitles, which like I said, always kind of interested me. And as we've read in some of our material, that's subtitling is a very transparent, a very vulnerable art, because especially for people like myself who speak both languages, it's very easy to be critical because you can hear one language, read the other, and you can easily be very critical of what the subtitler's done, come up with ways you may have done it differently. So that's although I generally found when I had a problem with something and I would say, well, that's wrong. Whenever I tried to take a step back and figure how I would have done it, a lot of times I ended up coming around to what the original subtitle was. So it led me to understand that there's a little bit more to subtitling than just putting down the words. So the specific video I chose to subtitle, and I'll put a link to it along with this video, is a TED Talk given by Jorge Ramos, who's a very famous Mexican journalist. He's, I think, spent most of his career with Univision in the United States, but he's very famous throughout the Spanish-speaking community. I've heard him referred to as the Mexican Anderson Cooper, because much like him, he's at a very young age he was gray-haired, kind of a very silver fox type of gentleman. In fact, at the end of my subtitling project, I had my wife kind of, as a non-Spanish speaker, watch the subtitled video to see if she had any comments or suggestions, and her only comment was that it was hard to keep her eyes focused on the bottom of the screen and watch the subtitles because Jorge Ramos is a very attractive man, and it was hard to tear her eyes away from looking at him to look at the subtitles down below. But apart from that, I think it went well. The way I approached the project, and I don't know if this was the most efficient way, but the first thing I did was create a Word document that had down one column the original Spanish text, and then in the other column the text that I translated into English, and then kind of use that as a baseline to use as for my subtitles. The video itself was in some ways easier to subtitle than if I had taken a dramatic work, just simply because the presentation is very austere. It was just a single person standing on a stage with a very kind of neutral background, just one guy up there speaking his thoughts. So there wasn't a lot of drama, wasn't a lot of action, not a lot of worrying about people speaking over each other, that sort of thing. So in that way it was easy, and it's also, as I mentioned, he's a Mexican Spanish speaker. So as the many versions of Spanish go, it tends to be one of the slower, kind of easier to understand, much at least in my experience, much more so than, say, Caribbean Spanish, which tends to be faster and choppier and a little harder to understand, at least for me. So so from then, once I found it, it took me a while to figure out how to convert it over, because obviously the video on YouTube was copyrighted, and they're not going to let just anyone enter their version of the subtitles. So it already had professional subtitles done to it, which I deliberately chose to not look at until very recently, actually until earlier today, just so I could do mine without being influenced by them. So our professor was able to help guide me how to download the video, upload it to my own site, so I could work on the subtitles at my own pace. So once I had done that, I took the guidelines in our subtitling textbook by Diacintas and Remael. We're mispronouncing that, but so to kind of using the math they had in there, tried to get it to where I wouldn't have any more than 30 characters per 2 seconds of video. So I was able to mostly keep it to that, I believe, and which obviously led to some interesting situations where I had to be creative as far as what I could include in there, and having to omit things and take things out. Just to give a couple examples of that, there was a couple instances where he referred to a tape recorder, which is a phrase that takes up a lot of characters, and he uses it over and over again in a very short period of time. So I had to kind of work around it, and rather than keep repeating it and using up that large block of characters, instead make shorter references back to the tape recorder, just saying, as I previously stated, or just things similar to that. You can, if you watch the subtitle video, you can kind of see how I did that. It was also he mentioned Pinochet and Castro, and then referred to them later as the general and the dictator, or something along those lines, and it wasn't enough room to put all that in there, so I just called them the leaders, which fit, and I think carried the meaning through. Speaking of, there were a couple, I guess what was referred to in the book as culture-bound translations, things that were that would be specific to the Mexican or the Spanish-speaking culture. One of which is, he talks about Mexican presidents picking their successors by what he calls a dedazo, which is, I I believe it's specific to Mexican Spanish. I'm not sure how much more widespread that is, but the aso ending on the end of it, dedo is Spanish for finger, so dedazo is usually kind of a slangy way of doing an action with that part of the body. So by saying dedazo, he was saying the presidents were, picking their successors by, forcefully saying that's the guy. So another way that can be used is a lot of times in soccer slang, something using the word pata for foot, they will say a patazo for a blow with the foot. So that's kind of along the lines of what that is. Now there's obviously no similar grammatical formula in English, so that I ended up translating as handpicked, since you're still using the same part of the body without kind of conveying a similar meaning. A couple other situations I ran into that were had to do with a couple times where there was English present in the video, and so for those I had to make the decision of, did I want to, or essentially consider, was I subtitling this for an English speaking audience, or was I translating it for an English speaking hearing impaired audience? So in other words, would I need to translate everything including the English, or would I just need to translate everything that was not in English? And actually, depending on the situation, went a couple different ways at different times. There was one where he just says, in the middle of the otherwise Spanish speech, says one sentence in English, and that one I kind of felt that if you weren't expecting it, even though he is speaking English, and even though I've heard him speak English before and he speaks it very well, it is with a thick Spanish accent. So I didn't know if someone listening to that wouldn't have immediately picked up that it was English. So that one I did leave subtitled in English with a comment in brackets, just in case people weren't paying attention, that he said that phrase in English. And then a little later on, he has a section where he shows a video of him at a press conference with our current president, and that was entirely in English. It was maybe about 2 minutes of the video, and that was entirely English. And I said, and since I was translating it just for people who did not speak Spanish, I left that part untouched, and just assuming that if anyone watching it was using the English subtitles, would be able to understand the English portion. Now and then, as I mentioned before, I didn't watch the professional subtitles before going in and doing mine, just so I could do it clearly. But I did earlier today actually go in and watch the professional subtitles, and could tell that there was a serious difference in quality between what they had put together and what I had done, as far as being someone who was extremely new to it. A lot of the solutions they had come up with were different than mine, and in most occasions, I would say better. So I would be like, oh, that's a much better solution than what I came up with. But even with theirs, they didn't seem to be following quite as closely the format for limiting the amount of characters for the time that subtitles were displayed, and they had some subtitles that, at least in my opinion, popped up and went away very quickly. So if you had glanced away for a second, you would completely miss it. So that was one of a few critiques I would have made, where I would have changed it, even changed their version of it. But in most cases, it was their version. Obviously, I'm sure these are people that was not their first time they've ever subtitled anything, so their version was quite a bit better. And so overall, it was, I think, a very worthwhile experience. It kind of taught me a little bit, the ins and outs of subtitling, and getting a chance to do it myself, and clearly make a lot of mistakes while doing so. I think is going to help me learn, and that's as I continue on in this profession, whether I do it full time or just kind of ad hoc on the side. I think this can only help, doing this sort of project over and over again. So it's been nice being in class with you guys the last few months, and feel free to reach out to me in the future if you have any projects or anything you want to collaborate on, or just stop in and say hello. So have a good evening, and I will see you later.